Okay, good evening to everybody out there who's managed to join us, of course, for another edition of live chats on Monday. Dumelang, Molweni, Sanbonani. And if you're joining us, especially from Maputo, then it is a Benvindo. That's it, right? I got that one right. Yes. Live chats is happening every Monday. This is the second season now at 6:30, just for 30 minutes of your time. We're meeting interesting people, doing interesting things, and having interesting discussions. So it's obviously great to have you here. And we pray, of course, that you may get enriched by the conversations that we'll have today, so that it's not just a thing to do, but actually some transformation that we can do for our communities and our societies in general. Right, so today, in that light, we have a guest, like I said, all the way from Maputo, Miss Tembe Miriam. How are you today?
Hey, Ronald, how are you doing? Thank you for having me.
I'm all right, thank you. And for those, of course, who are not familiar with Miss Tembe here, she's a humanitarian. She's an international trade specialist. She does big things, of course, in terms of international trade. So she's got the things. And like I said, based in Maputo, Mozambique, of course, single and looking. And I hope everything, of course, is going all right where you are.
Everything is fine. Everything's fine. Some things don't change, Ronald. Everything's fine. Just cold, not as cold as South Africa, but too cold for Mozambique.
I understand. And I think, speaking of Mozambique, we know, of course, something is happening there in the Cabo Delgado region, and we're praying, we're hoping, of course, that things don't spiral out of control. But from what you're hearing, is it something that's now really under control, or should we be worried?
Well, I think generally speaking, I think a lot of the discussions around what we're seeing from the news is that the region, as in the Southern African region, is starting to mobilize more lately. So let's see what happens in the coming weeks. There's been some deployments. SADC has committed itself to supporting Mozambique. So let's see what happens in the next coming weeks for the remainder of the year. But the situation in Cabo Delgado is dire.
All right.
The internally displaced people, the numbers are quite high. But yeah, we hope for the best.
That's true. And I think with you having been, of course, at the forefront of the COVID response there in Mozambique with your previous company, and of course with the cyclone Idai response, I mean, that of course hit Southern Africa earlier, you saw a lot of the work that has to be done on the ground to ensure that, people who are actually suffering and are affected by these things get food, get shelter, get clothing, etc., etc. Would you say we are ready to deal with such emergencies, obviously as humans first, but generally as Africans second?
I think you're talking about two different contexts. If we talk about Idai, we're talking about natural disasters, a lot of weather-related hazards. And I mean, as the context of Africa changes, as we become more vulnerable and more exposed to natural disasters and humanitarian crises relating to climate change, I think there's a lot more effort being made in terms of preparation. In Mozambique, for example, every year, just before the rainy season starts and before the cyclone season starts, the National Institute for Disaster Management hosts a meeting with all their partners trying to do contingency planning. And when I say partners, I'm talking about humanitarian partners in terms of making sure that we have everything in place should the rainy season and the cyclone season be as hectic as the previous years. Now, from a COVID-19 perspective, I mean, if countries like the US and countries in Europe struggled, and they're countries that are supposedly more advanced than us, have had a lot of things in place, a lot of systems in place. We as Africa, I mean, and I think this year we're really bearing the brunt of it. I think in terms of the rises with the cases, like it's getting really, really bad for Africa this year, not as bad as it was last year, not to undermine and not to give value to the crisis and the people that were affected by COVID in Africa last year. Obviously, the lives were also lost. So I think we still have a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that we're prepared to deal with such crises.
All right, that's good to hear. And I think when it comes now to you personally, I'm trying to think, of course, before, of course, we speak about the homeless situation there in light of the COVID response, you are quite passionate about the status of the homeless people, you know, and I think from working with you on some of the outreaches that you did while still in Pretoria, I know for sure that there's something that's really, really close to your heart. But I suppose people would want to know, why would someone like you who grew up in, forgive me, a privileged background, as it were, daughter of a diplomat, growing up in different countries, seeing all these beautiful capitals, you know, staying in Glitzi, Harare, for example, for quite a bit. Why would you care about, you know, issues about homeless people when you yourself have never been?
Oh, I think my story, I mean, I think everyone's story is unique, but I think my story in terms of my love and passion for the homeless started with my decision to go to university in Pretoria. And I always had this vision of, I'm going to go to South Africa, get educated, study international politics and development studies, to come back home to my country and make a difference. And something clicked around 2012 when I realized that, well, I'm staying in South Africa longer than I expected to, so why not start where I am? And as you know, as someone who's known me for years, I love to cook. And my engagement with the homeless, with people who are homeless in South Africa, started with me always cooking a lot of food and not wanting to throw away food. So I would go around close to Hillcrest looking for people that may want food, and that's kind of how it started. I just decided to start where I was, and at that time I was in Pretoria, I was in South Africa, I was a student, and I was quite fortunate to be surrounded with people like you and a lot of people from the LSM community, from my university, that were also passionate about giving back. So you talk a lot about growing up in privilege, but I think the values that my mother instilled in me, yes, I think I consider myself to be like the first generation of my family that didn't have a lot of challenges in comparison to my parents who were born in colonial Mozambique and grew up in a civil war. So I'm part of the first generation that didn't have to deal with all of that. So the values my parents instilled in me were about giving back and sharing. So I think that's where my passion for the homeless came in. In South Africa, it's so visible. In comparison to Mozambique, it's not very visible. It's the homelessness in South Africa is very visible, and that's kind of how it started for me.
And I think it's quite interesting that you say, because I'm thinking now, a lot of us lay people, if I can call myself a layman, of course, don't see homeless people as people who actually have a home somewhere. You know, they've got a mother somewhere, they've got a sister somewhere, they've got a brother somewhere. And that then almost diminishes or tends to make us look at the issue with less serious lenses, as it were. Are we right? Or should we be looking at this issue differently?
Definitely, we are not right. Definitely, we should be looking at this issue differently. Following my experience with the outreach activities I did in Pretoria, I decided to go back to do my master's. And I focused specifically on homelessness for like 3 years that I was working on my master's. And I focused specifically on homelessness amongst women, because I found out that that was very underdocumented. When people think of a homeless person, they think of a man, not a woman. But through my master's research and through even other initiatives that I was part of that worked with the homeless communities in South Africa, I learned a lot about the different circumstances that lead to homelessness. So we talk about pathways to homelessness. So yes, there are cases of people who have a family and they're homeless as a result of migration. I met a lot of people who are actually from Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Malawi and Zambia, who left their countries to come to South Africa in search of Igoli, in search of their El Dorado. So they have a home back in the original countries, but in South Africa, they don't have that. You also have people who may have migrated from KZN, from other provinces within South Africa. They have a home back then, but wherever they are in Pretoria, they don't have a place they call home. There's also, like I said, there's different factors, there's different reasons for people to find themselves homeless. There's also cases of even divorce. Looking at cases of women who, after being divorced or after losing their husbands and becoming widows, you know how patriarchy still exists in our world, and a lot of women get kicked out when their husbands die and they don't have anywhere to turn to, so they automatically become homeless and they end up relying on shelters if they can find a shelter. So I think the correct answer is we need to stop looking at homelessness as just a very like a simple oh, homelessness, and actually take the time to unpack the different issues. and understand that there are unique issues for each person and understand their context. It's not all black and white. It's a very, very colorful picture. And until we understand the causes of these various circumstances, and then we will understand why people are homeless. Even runaways, I also learned about, there's a lot of people who are adults today and have been homeless have been on the streets for about 20 years. Some of them ran away from their households as children. Looking at women specifically, I met a couple of women who when I met them, were in their 30s and their 40s. And they've been on the streets since they were 10, 11. And a lot of them ran away from home because of molestation and sexual abuse, the not being believed by their parents when they're being abused by an uncle, a relative, a neighbor, and feeling that they'll be safer on the streets. There's a story behind it. So yes, some people might have homes, other people not necessarily.
Yeah, that's really heartbreaking to hear some of these issues that you kind of use as examples. They try and enlighten some of us, as to the reasons why people end up on the streets. But I think from your conversations and from your interactions with them and through your research, of course, what would you say are the main, maybe 2 or 3 pathways, as it were, to get to see see people end up becoming homeless?
Well, number 1 would be unemployment. As we know, before COVID, unemployment was already an issue in a lot of countries. And so the inability to secure work makes it difficult for you to secure accommodation. So coupled with that comes poverty. Looking at my own research, there's issues around, like I said, for women specifically, I found out there was a lot of gender-based violence related to that. So I think for me, those would be the 2 main issues, or 2, 3 main issues: poverty, unemployment, and gender-based violence. Some of the contributing factors to the homelessness.
Right, in the past week, you've kind of mentioned that, Maputo has been slightly colder than usual, as it were. We spoke about global warming earlier. And Joburg, Pretoria, Gauteng, we've been under a cold spell for the past almost a week, I would say, actually. Very, very cold, but of course the month was cold. And I think even Joburg on Friday, probably when I was checking the temperatures, it was actually -6 degrees. Now I'm thinking, I'm complaining and I'm sitting in my house, I've got a heater, I've got a blanket, I've got all this warmth around me. From your experience and from your talking with these people, how is this time in particular, for them? How do they make it through? How do they survive through such bitterly cold conditions?
Borrowing from some of my findings, and looking at a context like South Africa, where the winter is quite harsh, and we're talking about people who are rough sleepers, substance abuse is one of the coping mechanisms actually for winter. So there are people who would actually buy like alcohol, and I'm not talking about alcohol in the sense of like buying at a liquor shop, that purple ethanol one that you use for cleaning, that is quite actually poisonous. A lot of them, a lot of the homeless people that I interacted with in the past, have actually talked about ingesting alcohol just to keep warm. For a lot of people, if they know winter is coming, the thing is, there's a lot of homeless people, but there are not enough shelters for the homeless. So trying to secure a spot during winter in a homeless shelter, you may be able to secure a spot, but it won't be very comfortable, but at least it might be better than staying outside and staying in a corridor. I don't know if number 2 Struben shelter in Marabastad is closed or not, because there was a lot of hoo-ha a couple of years ago. But I remember visiting that shelter, and I was told that during winter, it gets really, really, really packed. The conditions were not ideal at the time. I don't know what the current situation is right now. Like I said, there was a time there was talks about closing it down. But people who are staying there explained that during winter, a lot of people go there, and whatever corner they can find to accommodate themselves is better than being on a street corner or being somewhere on some road on brown streets in Pretoria, in CBD, right? So these are some of the different coping mechanisms people will use, but it's still tough. It's still tough relying on donations, blanket drives. I know to a lot of people, blanket drives sometimes sound corny, but a lot of the homeless people I've come across, they really appreciate it, because A lot of the times they don't even have anywhere to lie down on. So if they find a cardboard that night, great. If not, they're lying down on the pavement. So even having a blanket actually makes a difference. So those are the three main coping mechanisms that come to mind.
I was actually thinking about that earlier to say, you know, we do all these soup initiatives, we do these blanket drives, and every year it's like a traditional thing that people in the church do, people in the, you know, NGO community go on to try and help, you know, with these people that are homeless. Is that really actually effective? I wanted to find out from you. Or are we just trying to put a band-aid on a bigger issue altogether?
Well, definitely putting a band-aid on a bigger issue altogether. I think the solution to it wouldn't be, it's a temporary solution. It's a temporary solution. And unfortunately, we find ourselves doing it every year. It is a temporary solution because the bigger issue isn't, the issue isn't that it's cold. The issue is that they don't have anywhere to be when it's cold or when it's hot, or that's the issue. So until we can actually, if we could sort out the issue of accommodation and housing, and also sort out the different social cultural issues that contribute to people finding themselves homeless, maybe we wouldn't have so many people that are homeless on the street, and then maybe we wouldn't be looking at blanket drives and soup kitchens.
And I think before we go to a more practical and permanent solution, I want to find out now, with this lockdowns that we find ourselves in today, we're in level 3, tomorrow we're in level 5, and the next day is level 4, etc., etc. It changes, of course, and it has affected people. People have lost jobs, people have had their salaries cut, man, and it's just not right. Things are not as they used to be and as they should be. Now, I'm thinking, of course, we set up camps in Pretoria and Cape Town that people kind of even likened to concentration camps, where we sent these people, were rounded up off the street, put them in those camps, in living in tents, and, you know, living on literally basic food. I think we really, what can I say, did not give them the due dignity that's due to them at this particular time of obviously clear the streets to try and stop the spread of this COVID. Looking at the response from of course, a Mozambican perspective and from South African perspective, of course, from much reading, do you think we've done justice to this whole thing?
No. I think one thing you mentioned earlier when we were just prepping up is how quickly in South Africa the streets were cleared of everyone, including the homeless. But at the same time, the conditions in which they were placed were not ideal, even for the prevention of the spread of COVID-19. So we talk about social distancing. We talk about social distancing and flattening the curve, but then we also put people in 2,000 people in one space. Like, it's a bit contradictory to a certain extent. So have we done them justice? No. The fact that, and one point that you brought up is the fact that we could so quickly clear the streets. Why can't we so quickly sort out the issue of homelessness and housing? Because clearly, if these issues were sorted, we wouldn't be in this predicament. I think another thing we need to take into consideration when we're discussing COVID-19 and homelessness is the fact that, as you've mentioned, a lot of people lost employment. I think we need to discuss and we need to unpack a lot of the terminology that's related to COVID-19 and how it's actually not applicable to the homeless. So slogans such as stay at home, for a homeless person, not applicable. Slogans such as work from home, not applicable to everybody. So for people like me and you, where we have the ability to work from home, we kind of realize it's a privilege because not everyone has the ability to work from home. People need to leave their houses to secure their livelihoods. So how much worse is it for a person who's homeless that before COVID, they were already struggling to meet their basic needs? And I'm talking about access to food, access to water, sanitation, and hygiene, safety and security. They're already struggling before COVID. So how much harder is it now? So there's a lot of terminology that is just, actually, it's not very inclusive and it's not applicable to everyone, especially marginalized communities, members of society, such as homeless people.
Now, you've done in-depth studies, of course, prior to the COVID pandemic hit us, of course, and I'm sure you kind of had some sort of solutions that you had proposed anyway, or in your heart or in your head, to say, if we would do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we probably could be able to take care of this issue once and for all. Now, I'm thinking when you add COVID to the mix, what do you think has changed in your perception about the whole thing? And what really can our governments do to make sure that these people actually get something beneficial for the long term?
I think that's an interesting question. I think, like I said, homelessness as a whole, it's not just a one package and there's just how it looks. It's not black and white. You have to unpack the different factors that contribute to homelessness. So unemployment is one of them, poverty is one of them, the housing shortages is one of them. There are different things that need to be sorted. And even if you look at the governments, I'm sure South African governments, such as the Mozambican government, has made commitments towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which is one of the things that I brought forward in my master's dissertation, where in order for countries like Mozambique and South Africa to actually fulfill their commitments for the Sustainable Development Goals, they need to include everyone, including homeless people. So if you don't include their needs and their circumstances and you exclude them from the discussion, you're not actually, everyone else may be included, but you're still going to have this group of people who have not been catered to. So I think there's a need for governments to, first of all, understand the context, because the context is different. I'm pretty sure that the homelessness context in Mozambique is different from the South African context in Mozambique to a certain degree. So I think the call for governments is to understand what the context is in their own backyard, and tackle these different issues, because a lot of these issues, so going back to women's rights, the fact that women can lose their property, their right to property after losing their husband as a result of divorce. Even though the law might say one thing, these certain practices that are very patriarchal are still being implemented in parts of the country, in parts of the continent. So these are things that could have actually been prevented. These women who are on the streets or are relying on homeless shelters because their husbands passed away and they've been divorced and they don't have any property, these are issues that could be resolved quite easily, I think, in my opinion. So I think the call to government is unpack the different issues, figure out what's causing this and how can we deal with those different issues. And I believe that we will see the number of homeless people decreasing as we start dealing with the different issues that lead to people finding themselves homeless.
And looking at research, and the reports that have been coming through during, of course, this COVID era, I mean, even the Western nations themselves, the rich countries, have a big number of people that stay on the streets themselves. I mean, they have, some of them, 0 unemployment, 5% unemployment, etc., etc. They've got it good, and yet there are still people on the streets. So, of course, it probably comes back to the issue that you said, to what is the cause and what are the issues that are bringing people on the street. And looking at all of that now and adding it all up, are we ever going to eliminate this scourge of homelessness?
Whew, that's a difficult question to answer. I want to be hopeful and say yes, but the way the world is set up, it's so hard to actually see a world without poverty. It's hard to see a world without homelessness because there's so many different factors. I mean, if we're looking at the issues of substance abuse, I mean, if there are people who end up losing everything because of substance abuse. So there's so many different, components to take into consideration that I don't think it's going to be in my lifetime that we'll see everything, unfortunately. I think what we can try and focus, at least for the next coming years, is the prevention, the mitigation. I think that's something we can try and focus on. But also there's issues of equality that still need to be dealt with. I mean, we're still living in a world that has a lot of inequality. I mean, one thing about the South African context specifically, and I stated this in my dissertation, was you can't talk about the housing issue in South Africa without discussing apartheid. You can't. You can't. Like you can't talk about the housing issues in South Africa without talking about the history of apartheid and how that affected and how that continues to contribute to the issues. We also talk about the fact that during the first election campaign of the ANC, Houses for All was part of the mantra as part of their campaign, and it's still not a reality. And Nelson Mandela became president in 1994. So there's a lot that still needs to be done. And one of the biggest issues is when we start to tackle inequality in our societies, then maybe and really tackle inequality in our society, then maybe we'll be able to actually see significant changes in the issues we still have today.
And do you think there is that appetite with our policymakers at the moment? Do they actually want to get this thing sorted out?
You're trying to get me in trouble, Ronald. So, I mean, from the conversations I've had with a couple of people who are kind of in the sphere, yes. I think the biggest issue is, and I think that a lot of the times, and I'm going to echo the words of some of the homeless people I interacted with. A lot of the times they feel that homeless people that I interacted with, specifically in South Africa, they feel a little bit forgotten because a lot of them don't even have IDs to vote. So for them, it's like, well, I don't vote, I don't pay tax, so people don't care anyway. The government specifically, that's the sentiment that a couple of homeless people I've encountered in my work have brought forward. The fact that I don't pay taxes, I don't vote, so my existence to them doesn't matter. How I live doesn't matter, and that's a lot of the perception. So and I think it's up to policymakers and to make that effort. I mean, I will talk about a success story, not to sound like I'm bashing policymakers, specifically in the city of Tshwane, where the city of Tshwane back in 2014 launched an initiative called Pathways Out of Homelessness, and they decided to collaborate with a lot of different international institutes and academia in South Africa. So that included the University of Pretoria and the University of South Africa. And they actually challenged all the stakeholders involved to go out there and help them understand what the context of homelessness is in Tshwane. And so that they could amend the policy relating to homelessness in Tshwane so that it reflects the reality of what's on the ground in Tshwane. And that was done. Now, whether or not implementation is being done accordingly, I can't say exactly. So there has, in order for policy makers to actually take that initiative, you kind of require like people who are very passionate and interested to have a seat at the table to push that agenda. So it's relative, really, it's relative.
And I think, of course, we always tend to look to government for solutions about our social problems and social ills. And that doesn't normally come through. Like you said, it's been 25 years, of course, talking about homes for all. And of course, we still are yet to achieve that. What can you and I on the ground, as people that are just normal, what can we do to actually make a difference in these people's lives? Is there some sort of skilling that we can do? Is there some sort of, I don't know, something that we can equip these people with to make sure that on our level, at least, we are actually helping to deal with the problem going forward?
You know very well that I'd started an initiative back in my younger days in 2012 called Liranzu. And Liranzu for me was an idea, was more a concept of awareness raising and advocating, because a lot of these communities, marginalized communities, they don't have people to speak on their behalf. And that's one thing that we can do as people who have access to social media, as people who have a platform. We can raise awareness to their situation. That's one thing. Another thing is grassroots level initiatives are important. I think start small where you are. Even if it's just one person, even if you're sponsoring the education of one child, even if it's just in your neighborhood, trying to understand what the different issues are and trying to tackle those different issues. So I always like to refer to the Tshwane Leadership Foundation which is also in Pretoria, where they have a lot of different initiatives dealing with working with homeless people and marginalized communities, including sex workers and vulnerable children or at-risk children. And they really, back in the days when I used to like interact with them, they really had like, for example, for young vulnerable girls, they had like a house called the Rato House, where they were housing about 15 to 20 young girls. The number might be less. And they go through a rotation system. You know, they see these young girls grow. They fight for them to be able to get scholarships, to get an education, so that they can go all the way through university. And if you might say only 11 girls, but if you think about it, Like in the long run, it's a small group of, they deal with a small group of young girls in the beginning. And as they go in and out and they're given the tools to be independent and to be able to provide for themselves, they create space for other young girls. So initiatives like that are needed. We need more initiatives that are grassroots level, that are passionate and are interested and are dedicated to supporting vulnerable communities and marginalized members of society. So I think those are the things we can try and do.
That sounds practical enough. I think for everybody that's listening out there, you can at least take something out of that and say, you know what, I can try and do just this one thing, these two things to actually make a difference. And I think just as a wrap up, the last question is our 30 minutes is up. Mimi, to people that are watching today, you know, what is it that you want to actually tell them, you know, to understand about this homelessness situation? Is there anything they need to change in terms of perception? Or what's your word? What's your ministry? What's your gospel right now to tell us about?
Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions. Actually take the time to sit down with people and understand their story. I think a lot of the times we just assume that, oh, these people are, if I give them money, if I give them food, they're just going to sell it. Yes, it happens, but don't make assumptions. Actually take the time to understand their context. That's what I used to do. I mean, when I was living in Arcadia, you know, where you have the like sex workers, there are a lot of sex workers there. And I would, you know, take the time and spark a conversation. They're standing outside my building. I might as well ask questions and learn from them. So don't make assumptions. Actually take the time to understand what's going on with people, because it's not everyone's story is the same.
Thank you very much for that. That is very important, actually. I think it's actually in these outreaches that I actually also got to learn to understand that, you know what, it's not cut and dry. It's not the same story for everybody. And each person, of course, kind of has their own individual story of how they got there and how they need help. So I think, but thank you very much for appearing on our show tonight, Ms. Mimi. We appreciate you. We appreciate, of course, the insights that you have. And I'm really hoping for everybody else that's listening out there that you kind of got something that you can also do practically as well, try and make a difference in our society. Otherwise, from Maputo, obrigado.
Ciao, Ronald. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to reconnect with you again.
Sharp. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and until next week same time, we'll be seeing you soon. Goodbye.
Ciao.